forum on immigration and the election. We have three speakers, and I'll introduce them in a moment, but want to try to give folks a few ground rules. One of them, as you probably all know how to mute yourselves, and so if you're not speaking, please do. And then when you want to speak, you're able to unmute yourself, and that's relatively easy. There will be a chat down below the list of set of people in either Spanish or English, depending on which way the translation's going. If you're not familiar with the two main views, up in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, there's you can either choose gallery view, where you see everybody, or you can choose speaker view, where whoever is speaking is highlighted. And that's why we all need to be muted, because if we cough all of a sudden, then we end up being the speaker. The point of today's discussion is to take a look at the shifts in immigration and immigration law and et cetera, to see what today and history can tell us about the future of immigration affairs in the United States, particularly looking forward to the next election. Our three speakers, David Speener, professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And are you still department chair, David, or did you succeed?
Thank goodness, no. Jennifer Matthews is now the chair.
Okay, yes, I, as a former department chair, I fully understand that. He has studied and taught on Mexico and US border issues forever. And here is a copy of his book, which is marvelous. Clandestine Crossings, Migrants and Coyotes on the Texas-Mexico border. The result of multiple years of research. And he'll be giving us some historical background and some other material. Sarah Ramey is a human rights lawyer and working in immigration issues. Began working in DC and then has working for American Friends Service Committee, and has been, you've been here, I think, about 3 years, Sarah. I'm not sure exactly how long.
Since 2014 in San Antonio and 2012 in Texas.
Okay. And the third is a Guatemalan immigrant who, for privacy reasons, we're not using a name. And we will not be discussing his particular story, but would like to be called Le Professor. And he will be talking about focusing on not his experience, not his immigration story, but on his experiences as an immigrant in the United States. So I think we should jump directly to the folks. We are recording, and the recording will be available through the Migrant Center for Human Rights after we're done. I know we have at least one visitor from a human rights group in Maryland that is very interested in seeing not all of their people can come. So they're very interested in seeing that. Please put your questions in the chat, and we will be monitoring the chat, and we'll do each of the three speakers and then question and answer when we're done. Sarah, is there anything else that I need to include?
Jim, I believe you had a point on the nonpartisan nature of this event, that we won't be taking in a political position.
All right. I just assume that, but then you're absolutely right. This is a nonpartisan event. Presenters will be focusing on policies and practices and their effects on the community. We kindly ask that participants also focus their questions on substantive issues, and refrain from using today's conversation to discuss personal opinions, political or otherwise. This is an informative educational setting. So, David, may we ask you to start? And you're going to need to unmute.
I'm so used to being the host of these things as a teacher that I'm always unmuted to start with, but okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Sarah and the Friends House in San Antonio. I think the thing that's really important to realize is that what's been happening with regards to immigration and with regards to what's happening on the US-Mexico border has changed tremendously in the last less than a decade, really. I have been studying US-Mexico border issues and Mexican migration to the United States for a quarter of a century, I guess. And during that time, it was always the case that Mexicans were always the vast majority of people who were being detained at the border, to the point where the Border Patrol had a special designation for people that they apprehended coming across the border who were not from Mexico. They were called OTMs, other than Mexicans, right? I mean, the Border Patrol traditionally, since its creation in 1924, had been a special police force that was especially dedicated to the policing and capture, arrest, and detention and deportation of Mexicans, right? And one of the things that was part of the process of the situation of Mexicans was a practice known as voluntary return. And I'm happy to see my old friend and colleague Lee Teran of St. Mary's University's Human Rights Law Clinic in the audience. I can remember consulting with you, Lee, about trying to understand how all of these things worked in the legal system. And Lee was very, very helpful as I was doing research for my book on clandestine crossings. There was something called being VR'd, voluntarily returned to Mexico. And it wasn't really voluntary. What it was basically was that if you were Mexican and you were detained by the Border Patrol, and upwards of 90% of the people detained by the Border Patrol up until about 2012, 2013 were Mexican, you could basically give up your right to a formal immigration court hearing to avoid a formal deportation and say that you were willing to voluntarily be walked back across the bridge from Texas or across the border, that line in the sand in Nogales or in San Diego, and you wouldn't have a deportation on your record and you wouldn't have to spend any time in detention. Strangely, starting in the early 1990s, increased border enforcement by the US government actually caused the number of undocumented people in the United States to grow dramatically by ending the circular migration of Mexicans, as it became more difficult, more dangerous, and more costly to come across the border without documents between the legal ports of entry, rather than people coming for a few months, mostly young men to come for a few months, to earn a certain quantity of money, and then return back to their homes in Mexico. The cost of paying a coyote, the dangers of having to walk long distances through the very rugged brush country or desert along the Texas-Mexico border or other parts of the border, Arizona, Sonora, out in Baja California, meant that you were likely to stay a lot longer period of time because it was just too much effort, too much danger, too much money for you to be going back and forth on a routine basis. And since most of the people who were migrating across the border at the time were young Mexican men under 30, young Mexican men and young men of any age do lots of silly and complicated things. They fall in love with people and they have children with people who are born then in the United States who are then US citizens. They find work and they get good at it. And they decide that, staying in the United States rather than going back and forth and exposing themselves to all those kinds of dangers and working as somebody who knows how to do stucco or somebody who knows how to do wiring as an electrician and things like that, it makes you want to stay, right? And so then we end up with the worst of all possible worlds, right? Circular migration between Mexico and the United States comes to an end. And we start to see, as a consequence of increased border enforcement in the 90s and early 2000s, the rapid growth of an undocumented population that's no longer people who are birds of passage coming through and staying for a little while and then going home, but rather are permanently undocumented with no chance of ever really regularizing their situation, especially as under the Clinton administration in the 1990s, immigration laws got stricter and stricter. Now, following the Great Recession by the 2010s, Central Americans, for the first time in the history of the border, especially from the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, become the majority of migrants apprehended by the Border Patrol. This is unheard of, right? It used to be above 90% of people apprehended by the Border Patrol were from Mexico, okay? And the other thing to remember is that although they become the majority of people being apprehended, the total number of people apprehended is far smaller than had been the case for Mexican apprehendees prior to the Great Recession, right? So instead of the Border Patrol apprehending, you know, around 1 million people or making around 1 million apprehensions a year, the number goes down to 200,000, 300,000, et cetera. And the majority are people from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, right? With much smaller numbers from some other places. And rather than being traditional labor migrants, Central Americans, who are now the majority of those who are apprehended at the border, are best thought of as displaced persons fleeing their countries for reasons of gang violence, political repression, climate change, and dispossession of lands that they worked as subsistence farmers, right? The other thing that we have to bear in mind with all of this is with the Great Recession, the two big magnets for Mexican labor migrants collapse, right? And that is the construction industry, right? And service work in restaurants, hotels, and things like that. Those were especially hard hit by the Great Recession 10 years ago. That greatly reduced demand for Mexican immigrant labor in the United States, most of it undocumented. The other thing that happens is that Mexico goes through, finally, its demographic transition, which is to say that as people become residents of urban areas, the family stops being a unit of production and becomes a unit of consumption. That means having children becomes not a net economic gain, but a net economic expense, in economic terms, for families. So that whereas in 1970, a woman in her childbearing years in Mexico would have something like 6 live births during her childbearing years, by the turn of the century, it's down to around 2.3, 2.4, which is very similar to the United States. So the Mexican population ages. The number of people entering into the labor market every year in Mexico goes down, both in absolute terms and in relative terms. And migration to the United States with the reduced demand for migrant labor because of the Great Recession drops dramatically, okay? Now, in Central America, on the other hand, there has been labor migration for years, okay? But nothing like the scale of Mexican labor migration. Mexico is a country of 130 million people right next door to the United States with more than a century-long tradition of mass migration to the United States. Central American migration doesn't really begin hardly at all until the 1970s, and it's largely a consequence of the result of violence in those societies that has to do with US foreign policy and the Cold War and military governments, et cetera, okay? So the big detention problems that have arisen in places like Texas in recent years has to do with, in large measure, with the replacement of Mexicans by Central American migrants. Central American migrants can't be VR'd, as the Border Patrol likes to say, back to Mexico. They can't be voluntarily returned. Why? Because they're not Mexican. And Mexico has no obligation to receive people from the United States being asked to leave the United States without Mexico being willing to receive them. And so the detention problem becomes very complicated. People are being held for extended periods of time in waiting for planes that will deport them back to their countries of origin. in places like El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, okay? And so this is something back in 2014 when we first started hearing about that horribly named surge of Central Americans coming to the border. Horribly named because the term surge came from the Iraq War. It's a military term. We weren't being invaded. It wasn't a military crisis. Rather, it was a humanitarian crisis at the border, okay? But those folks just can't be told, oh, do you want to go through official deportation proceedings, or do you want to just walk back across the border and either go back home in Mexico or try your chances again? No, they've got to be deported a long distance away by airplane typically, et cetera, back to El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras, okay? The other thing that happens in recent years, and I'll finish here because I want to give everybody plenty of time to speak and ask questions, et cetera, is that under the Obama and the Trump administrations, okay, there is a return to what was known as interior enforcement. During the Clinton and the second Bush administrations, the focus was on trying, the United States Border Patrol, trying to apprehend migrants as they came across the border, instead of conducting workplace and neighborhood raids in the US interior, which caused lots and lots of problems involving danger to migrants, residents of communities, et cetera, and created all kinds of controversies well in the interior of the United States. The emphasis in the Clinton administration and the second Bush administration was on detaining people at the border and border enforcement, and there was very little in the way of workplace enforcement or community raids of migrants' homes in the US interior. But during the Obama administration, and then ramped up during the Trump administration, workplace raids and raids on the homes of immigrants far from the border dramatically increased, okay? And that led to massive numbers of official deportations occurring. And by official deportation, I mean not that you were apprehended by the Border Patrol and asked if you were willing to walk back across the border without spending time in detention, without having to go through a formal immigration hearing, but rather you were formally deported from the interior of the United States, where maybe you had been living and working for a number of years, maybe you had children that had been born in the United States, where you may have been well integrated into a neighborhood, into a workplace, et cetera, and then you were deported. And there are multiple reasons why that change occurred, but I'm gonna set that aside for the moment and turn the floor over to other folks.
Thanks very much, David. Sarah, I believe you're next.
Okay, I'm going to kick us off in discussing the candidates' positions. And if it seems like I'm talking slow, that's to help our interpreter who's providing closed captions in Spanish. And if everyone goes to the chat box, I just sent a Google document that is an outline of some of what we'll be talking about today that you can save and refer to later if you like. So to get started, I'd like to talk a little bit about how cases are being processed at the border under the Trump administration. We've seen this year several policies that are important to keep in mind. The first one I'll mention is Operation Capio, and that is where CBP has used the CDC guidance to basically deny entry to the United States of thousands of people. The last count I heard, I think, was about 50,000 people. Most of those are asylum seekers. And we've seen at the Migrant Center a drop in asylum cases as a result in the last month or two. In fact, we've seen the lowest numbers since basically we founded the Migrant Center back in 2017. We, under the Trump administration, have seen a variety of policies to restrict access to the asylum system. First, we had the turn back policy where people were basically being told that they couldn't enter, that the US was full, they needed to come back the next day. Then we had metering, where people were given a number and told they had to wait their place in line for processing. And then, of course, we have the Remain in Mexico program, officially known as MPP, for Migration Protection Protocol, where people are waiting in Mexico to have their cases processed. All of those cases have been postponed since COVID started in the US, or shortly thereafter. So I believe the first announcement was either at the end of March or beginning of April that those cases would be postponed, and they're continuing to be postponed. We also had the signing of third country agreements, and individuals have been sent back to Guatemala to have their cases processed there. And these are non-Guatemalans, just to make sure that point's clear. The government has also signed agreements with El Salvador and Honduras, but we have not to date that I'm aware of sent people to either of those countries for case processing.
Sarah, I just want to interject that this business about the MPP and the third-party agreements are historically absolutely unprecedented in the history of the border. This is something that is totally new, that's very different from any previous administration.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I mean, we are seeing a whole new world, for those of us working on the border with people, whether that's in detention or outside detention, we're seeing really a whole new environment and way of case processing that's pretty dramatic, and in the large part violations of human rights as well as U.S. law. But we'll leave that discussion for later if people have questions, and we have some materials on that as well. Now, another important border processing point is criminal prosecutions. So criminal prosecutions have skyrocketed under the Trump administration for both entry and re-entry. And these are felony charges that, if folks remember, Castro had brought to the national debate stage in calling for them to be eliminated, right? So it's no longer be a felony to enter or re-enter without documents. Now, you'll hear the term illegal entry and illegal re-entry. I don't use that term because asylum seekers have the right to seek asylum regardless of the manner of entry. So under the Obama administration, and to my knowledge, David, perhaps you can speak to this, under the Bush administration and going back to Clinton and Bush before that, asylum seekers typically have not been prosecuted for unlawful entry. And that has changed. So unless the statute makes clear that they should be exempted, then it's really up to the executive what they want to do. Keeping in mind that outside of statute, most immigration authority rests with the executive branch, which is to say whoever's elected president. And that's a large reason why we wanted to have this discussion with everyone today. Now, folks are probably aware that these criminal prosecutions is what enabled family separation to take place, because parents, mothers, and fathers were taken from their kids, put through the criminal process while the children were being processed through the immigration system. And we just want to note that on family separation, we're still seeing cases. I just met a man today who's separated from his wife, where we've seen these family separations from before the official family separation policy went into effect. And that's husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, all sorts of family separation, and then of course of children who turn 18 and are considered adults. But the gravity of the situation became, as everyone knows, very severe in 2018, and we are trying to still reunify families, right? So there's been a very long-lasting impact for this policy. The last thing that I'll mention before turning it over to David to make a few comments on Biden's response to Trump, what Trump's done, is in terms of the border wall, most of the construction that's happened has been for replacement fencing, for wall sections that have been degrading over time. Only 5 miles of new wall have been built. We have seen a transfer of funds from other departments to fund border wall construction, and that's been of concern to some people within the Department of Defense and others. And then lastly, one continuing issue, this is not specific to necessarily to Trump, but he certainly hasn't really worked on this, is the hiring process for CBP agents, and also the process for investigating and punishing people who commit abuses at CBP border checkpoints and holding facilities. There's been a real issue with accountability throughout various administrations in this respect. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to David to make a few comments before we move on to the other subjects.
Now you can hear me. Those are excellent points, Sarah, about what's been going on. And of course, you're in the trenches doing this work on a day-to-day basis, so you're very much up to date on these things. I thought I'd mention a few things that the Biden campaign has not actually discussed that haven't made public in terms of what their orientation or what their policy is likely to be, that relate to some of the things that Sarah has just talked about. One is that for most of the history of the US-Mexico border, very few people were ever charged with criminal illegal entry of the United States. That's in section 8 or 18 of the US Code. I can remember if it's 8 or 18, but 1325, illegal entry. It's misdemeanor illegal entry. And one of the things that Joe Biden has said in the debates among the Democrats is that he does not believe in decriminalizing unauthorized border crossing between ports of entry, okay? He hasn't given any indication that I'm aware of about whether his new administration would have the same kind of zero tolerance policy for misdemeanor illegal entry that the Trump administration has engaged in. In other words, by zero tolerance, it means that anybody that enters the United States between the legal ports of entry without an inspection would be charged with misdemeanor illegal entry under the US Criminal Code, okay? Nor has he talked about another big potential problem, even though he says he's in favor of giving undocumented immigrants a path to citizenship. There's been no discussion about decriminalization of criminal immigration offenses. There's been a big increase in the criminalization of the act of migration itself, as Sarah was mentioning, under both the Bush and the Obama administrations, right? So one of the problems is that lots of people, if you've been living in the United States for a period of time, have children in the United States, have a job in the United States, have a spouse in the United States, and you get deported formally from Austin or Philadelphia or from wherever, if you come back into the United States after being formally deported, you're guilty of felony illegal re-entry after deportation. And there are tens of thousands of people who are undocumented in the United States today that have been convicted of either misdemeanor illegal entry or felony re-entry, okay? And when the Obama administration was talking about going after only criminal aliens, many of the criminal aliens that they were going after were people whose only criminal offense was in fact their act of migration itself, right? And so this is potentially very, very problematic in terms of a path to legalization and citizenship for the 11 million undocumented people in the United States. Tens of thousands of them are convicted felons, right? Not because they're dangerous criminals, but because they have a felony immigration offense. And there are now more people in federal prisons for immigration offenses than there are for federal drug offenses. This has been true for at least the last 10 years. The other thing is that this status of being somebody who is a felon, who has re-entered after immigration, even after deportation, even though the only reason you're a felon is that you're an immigrant, can be used by ICE to prioritize raids on immigrant homes, right? So far, the Biden administration has remained silent on this. The other thing that the Biden campaign, I should say, not administration, has left without saying is whether it intends to change the number of Border Patrol and ICE agents, and the budgets of these government agencies or these government units, right? The number of Border Patrol agents in the early 1990s was only about 2,500. Now it's over 20,000, right? There has been a huge increase in the amount of equipment and in the amount of personnel dedicated to the policing of the entry of people mainly from Latin America, many people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry whose ancestors were here before the creation of the border that now separates Mexico and the United States. There's also no information from the Biden campaign about whether they intend to review ICE and Border Patrol personnel and their potential racial biases and their membership in white supremacist or other hate organizations, which has become a big problem in many police organizations around the country, and that we know exists within the Border Patrol today. The other thing has to do with this whole business about criminal aliens. The Biden administration Biden campaign proposes to go back to the Obama-Biden administration's policy of using executive prosecutorial discretion to focus enforcement efforts on people who are criminals, right? Criminal aliens, right? As opposed to just looking for people who might be undocumented in the interior of the United States. The problem is that, or not the problem, but one of the things to bear in mind is that criminal aliens almost always involves the deportation of convicts who have already served their sentences in state prisons and jails, right? These are not people who are fugitives from the law, but rather these are people who have been released from jail or prison, right? And that then ICE goes about trying to find and deport, okay? In other words, these aren't people on the lam from the law exactly. These are people who have already been in US prisons and jails, have served their sentences, and have then been released back into the United States as more or less free people, but still undocumented. To my knowledge also, and Sarah, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, the Biden campaign has not stated a position on whether it believes local law enforcement agencies around the country should cooperate or not with immigration authorities. Okay? This has been a big part of the Trump administration's rhetoric, the so-called sanctuary cities as being an example of lawlessness and not coming down hard on immigration. And the other thing I wanted to mention that the Biden administration, nor any administration that Biden campaign, I keep saying administration, sorry. The Biden campaign has not made clear is whether it contemplates any changes to the baseline number of immigrant visas available to the different nations around the world. In 1965, with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which was really a series of amendments to the act that I think first passed in 1924, it got rid of all of those racist quotas that gave preference to white migrants and immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, okay? And to solve that problem, this was something that was at the behest of then Senator Edward Kennedy, they decided to give an equal number of visas to every country in the world. One nation, one vote in the United Nations, one nation, 20,000 visas to all the nations in the world. The problem with that is that there was no weighting by population of the countries and no weighting by past historical links to the United States, so that a country like Mexico, with a more than century-long tradition of migration to the United States, and that shares an international border with the United States, gets the same visa allotment as New Zealand, right? That doesn't have much of an historical relationship with the United States and doesn't have many people seeking to migrate to the United States, and also has a small population. The Central American countries also have this problem because of the relationship that they have had with US companies over the years, and also US military interventions in their countries. They are not nearly the size of the population of Mexico, but there is a special historical relationship there that might warrant different kinds of treatment than just any other country in the world. And I'll stop there. I think that kind of covers some of the things that are parallel to the things that Sarah was mentioning.
Okay, well, David brings up a really good point that you'll see reflected in the conversation as we continue, which is that Biden really hasn't come out and said what his position is on a lot of these issues. And to give an example, he has said that he'll work on reuniting children with their parents, but he hasn't said if he's going to do continue doing other forms of family separation. And so, there's a lot of ambiguity still in his position. Now, he has said that he's going to end MPP and that he'll process cases, including that he'll end the metering policy. But again, he hasn't said what his position is on the third country agreements, whereby we're sending asylum seekers to Central America for case processing. And the fear there from the immigrants that we've spoken with is that if you send an El Salvadoran or a Honduran to Guatemala, the same gangs that they may be fleeing from have easy access to find them and to continue persecuting them. So the numbers of people who've actually put in asylum claims in Guatemala that have been returned under this program is very, very low. The last I heard, I think it was 2 people. Maybe it was about 7 had started the process and 2 had continued. And I think a few hundred have been returned. So we would like to see, as an organization, more of a statement from the Biden campaign on what they're going to stand for. And at the end of today's presentation, I'll give some ideas of how people can get involved with talking to the candidates and otherwise letting your position be known and having a say in this process. Because it being an election time, it's especially important, but this is a continuing conversation that our country has been having, and I think will continue to have regardless of who's elected. Now I'd like to talk a little bit, follow up from some of what David said about interior enforcement. And so first off, the Trump administration has tried to increase the data collection, not only from immigrants, but also from residents and U.S. citizens who are going through these checkpoints. So there have been proposals to increase DNA testing. I believe some of that has happened, but I don't think that it's really been widely rolled out. Mostly this has been done on occasion to prove familial relationships without really giving someone an option, right? And there was a proposed rule, basically a regulation that the administration would like to put into place that is open for public comment right now. And the public has until October 13th to let the administration know if they're in favor or against all or part of this proposed rule that will be increasing the amount of biometrics collection. The number of arrests of non-criminal immigrants, of course, has gone up because there's not this idea of prosecutorial discretion anymore, whether that's an ICE attorney decision in court or whether that's an ICE officer going in to arrest folks at a facility. So we've been seeing an increase in arrests at courthouses, which has scared domestic violence victims and others from going and pursuing a legal process in a state court. And we've also seen various immigration raids, including raids that were just took place during COVID very recently, and raids that were just announced. We'll see if the administration follows through. But there was announced, I believe, yesterday saying that the administration is looking at conducting raids in so-called sanctuary jurisdictions. And I say so-called because the federal government has immigration enforcement authority in all communities, so there's no true sanctuary in any city or state. Now, the administration has not been, to my knowledge, doing any sort of enforcement activity in any schools or in hospitals, but interestingly, not fairly recently, on the ICE COVID information page, the language was taken away that said they would not be going to and making arrests at hospitals. And we have certainly seen on occasion when people are trying to go to hospital from the border, they have to go through the checkpoint. ICE will then process them and accompany them to the hospital. The other thing that has happened under the Trump administration is that individuals who have overstayed their permission to be here are now being fined hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases. Of course, they're not going to be able to pay those, but that's another way that the administration is, letting people know that they're not welcome if they don't have legal status here. Sort of as a result of all of these various policies, we are seeing people taking refuge in church. I was reading an article today about an individual family that had been over 2 years living in a church and is now moving to a different church and continuing to try to find a way of being legally in the United States, because our immigration laws ultimately are very limited. And there are not pathways to residency or citizenship for a lot of people. So whether or not comprehensive immigration reform is something that's feasible politically, whether that's something that the Trump or Biden administration will pursue. I know Biden has mentioned that he wants to look at that option. Those are all sort of still open questions. One of the statutes that is problematic and where there's some executive power is the expedited removal statute. So the law says that anyone who's been in the United States for 2 years, anywhere in the country, so anyone who's been less than 2 years in the United States can be picked up and deported without ever seeing a judge. Okay, unless they claim asylum. But that means they're not going to have the right to claim cancellation of removal or pursue other options in court that may exist to them normally. The previous administrations have taken this law and basically said, well, if we pick you up within 100 miles of the border and within 14 days of entry, you'll be an expedited removal. The Trump administration said, we're going to go to the maximum the statute allows. We're going to say anywhere in the US and any time within 2 years. And we haven't really seen that play out in practice, but that is something that's a real concern, because how do you prove that you've been here 2 years, right? When you don't have documents, it can be very difficult to have official paperwork, etc. And the expedited removal happens very quickly, often, especially if you're from Mexico and there's no flight that needs to be arranged. Then the last point that I just to reflect on a little bit is this relationship between the states and the federal government. So not only has the Trump administration pursued these 287G programs, which is where ICE basically deputizes local police officers to act as immigration agents. So it gives them federal authority to, issue arrest warrants and detain people. There was this program. It was called a Citizens Academy that was going to be this fall in Chicago. And through a lot of advocacy, this program was actually stopped. And Citizens Academy was basically to train regular civilians like you and I to act as ICE agents. There's obviously a lot of concern that was going to lead to, abuse and racial profiling, et cetera. And so that's been put on hold. But that is something that's been in discussion within the Trump administration, and I wouldn't be surprised if that comes up in discussion down the road should he be reelected. The other thing that we've seen a lot of with regards to sanctuary jurisdictions is the administration attempting to take away funding for law enforcement if there's a sanctuary jurisdiction. Now, these are two separate issues, right? Law enforcement is policing and other issues related to that. And then we have immigration policy. And most courts that have looked at this issue around the country have basically said you cannot deny federal grant money to jurisdictions that don't want to enforce federal immigration law, because again, those are two separate things. But this is a policy that the administration has continued to try to push through. And so most of the court orders we have are localized to that jurisdiction, and so this is kind of a continuing discussion. And I'll turn it over to David just to see if he has any comments on anything else on this sort of on-tier enforcement or any of these other points that I've made.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm not on mute. You can all hear me. Okay. Well, a couple of things to bear in mind about the differences between the Biden administration, or Biden, I keep calling it the Biden administration. This is not a Freudian slip. He was in an administration before. That's why I keep saying that. Joe Biden does not support getting rid of ICE, as certain members of the Democratic Party like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have. Okay? He has said that he wants to reverse family separation. He has said that he will end, as Sarah was saying, the migration protection protocols, the sending of mainly Central Americans, but people from other countries as well, across the border into Mexico or even to places like Guatemala to await the adjudication of their asylum cases. He says that he's not going to place any limits on the number of asylum applications accepted by DHS on a daily basis. And he promises sufficient resources so that asylum applications are going to be processed fairly and efficiently. Of course, these are questions that involve budgetary matters and will have to involve appropriations by Congress in order for him to carry out that promise. He's also said that he wants to reinstate DACA, the so-called Dreamers program, that will include with a roadmap to citizenship that would have to go through legislation to occur, and that would also include the parents of the Dreamers, not just the Dreamers themselves, which is important. He has said that he wants to rescind the so-called Muslim ban that the Trump administration imposed early on upon assuming the presidency. He says that he wants to end workplace raids that threaten labor rights and the ability of immigrants to join unions. And he also wants to ensure due process rights and human rights of immigrants that are detained. And these presumably are things that he could do through the discretion that he would have as president that wouldn't necessarily require legislation to go through Congress, right? He also says he wants to remove the roadblocks to naturalization. There are, I think, over 1 billion people right now who are green card holders who are wanting to naturalize, who are qualified to naturalize, but have yet to have their hearing and are just waiting for the bureaucratic process to be completed. And he says that he wants to get rid of those roadblocks and eliminate the naturalization backlog. This would have also to do with hiring enough people to be able to process all of the applications, and that might also require an act of Congress in terms of budgetary matters. He's also talking about a path to legalization for long-term agricultural workers, which is important. We realize that a very large amount of the food that we consume in the United States is planted, cared for, and harvested by immigrant undocumented hands. At the same time, he's also talking about wanting to give more rights to foreigners who are participating in expanded guest worker programs so that they would be able to switch jobs, be able to exercise more rights, et cetera, but they still wouldn't have a path towards becoming legal permanent residents in the United States or eventually becoming citizens. So that is something like we might have called the old Bracero program that existed up until 1965. And there are hundreds of thousands of people working and living in the United States today that are temporary guest workers, and Joe Biden would like to see that expanded. In terms of refugees, he is talking about wanting to raise the annual cap on refugees, I think, to 70,000. Sarah, you can correct me on that.
I'll be talking about that just in a minute here.
Okay, so we don't have to get into that. The things that are related to internal enforcement. He would, says he would end for-profit detention centers and also reverse the public charge rule. In other words, right now, and it's been part of immigration law for a long time, if you can't demonstrate your ability to support yourself, you can't, when you migrate to the United States or your relatives aren't in the United States aren't willing to say that they will support you, you can be denied the opportunity to become a legal permanent resident. And that's been in the law for at least half a century, maybe longer, I think. But it had not been routinely enforced until the Trump administration came into place. And Joe Biden says he will exercise discretion on that. And the other thing, I guess, that's relevant to the current sort of section that Sarah is outlining for us is that he would ensure due process rights and human rights of immigrants who are detained. That is an important difference between him and the current president's position. And he also wants to protect undocumented immigrants who want to press for their rights, labor rights as employees, and their rights to organize and join unions. That is also a significant difference from the current policy. Sarah?
So following up on that, I mean, we really haven't seen a huge change in detention policy between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. We've had a detention bed quota for a long time in this country, which is where we as taxpayers fund a certain number of beds. If I recall correctly, it's at 35,000 beds, which means whether they're full or not, we're paying for them. So that creates a false incentive to fill those beds, whether we need to or not. We have seen an increase in the number of people detained, and both because of border crossings as well as interior enforcement. At one point, we were over 50,000 people in detention, and the administration went to Congress and said, "Hey, we need more money." Right? There have been multiple calls out of the Trump administration for more funding for detention, as well as border work. With regards to refugee admissions, we are at the historic low. Since we signed the Refugee Act in 1982, we have never been this low. So the number has been slashed from the end of the Obama administration, which was 110,000 to 18,000. And as of, I think, about a month ago, the number we had admitted into the country during the fiscal year 2019 was under 10,000. And so that, as David mentioned, that's one thing that Biden has come out and said very specifically, that he wants to increase that refugee number to 125,000, so going even above the Obama administration, and then continuing to increase that with this idea of burden sharing between countries. I don't like that term because I don't think we should look at refugees as burdens. There's good data out there that refugees contribute enormously to revitalizing communities, including ones that are on the decline, and are really, contributing. So, but the idea is that there is a cost involved in processing these cases and getting people to the country and integrating them, teaching English and et cetera. And so that's a little bit where that idea of burden sharing comes from. We have seen drastic changes in asylum policy. And just so everyone's on the same page, a refugee is typically referring, when we use refugee, we're typically referring to someone whose case is processed outside the United States. Asylum is for people who are processing their cases inside the United States. Now, this gets a little bit confusing because a refugee is also anyone who meets the legal definition of a refugee, regardless of what process they're going through. But for the purpose of this conversation, when I'm talking about asylum policy, we're talking about what's affecting people going through the process here in court or before USCIS, doing an affirmative case. The administration has redefined what it means to be a member of a particular social group, basically eliminating protection for people fleeing violence based on gender, based on family association, and based on gang problems. The administration is also in the process of redefining and limiting what's considered persecution and what's considered a political opinion, among other things. Those are rules that have been put forward. In fact, this almost seems to be a new trend of the administration since about June of this year. Every month, really every several weeks, it seems like, the administration is proposing a new regulation. And in fact, there was one that I just saw proposed today. that I haven't had a chance to look at, but for those of you who are not on the Migrant Center listserv and would like to receive updates on these items, you can email us. I'll put the email address in the chat and towards the end, and you're more than welcome to just let us know through chat as well. So we saw the transit ban from July 16th of last year, saying if someone has come through another country, they can't get asylum. They're only eligible for more limited forms of protection that don't allow them to reunify with their families. And that's currently been put on pause by the district court in DC, but that's something that we don't know how the court's going to decide, and so this may be an issue that the new president gets to weigh in on. We also, for another opportunity for advocacy, we have public comments due this coming up in October as well on another proposed regulation that requires asylum applications to be filed within 15 days. And I can tell you as an attorney, having done a lot of asylum cases, that's practically impossible. So we have an analysis of that rule that we'll be sharing with our listserv, and of course, folks have comments on that or questions on that, more than happy to take those now or at any later time. The last point I would make, sort of related to asylum, that's of crucial importance, is the independence of our court system. As most folks probably are aware, the court system is part of the executive branch, not the judicial branch. So the administration, whether that be Trump, whether that be Biden, can basically set policies for the immigration courts. And the Migrant Center's position, as well as the American Bar Association, AILA, I mean, a lot of groups out there really want Congress to step in and make the courts independent, right? Regardless of what your personal political beliefs are, the judicial system really, in terms of our checks and balances and democracy, should be independent. So that I'm going to allow myself to make a little bit of an opinion statement in that regard. So because things have become very political in the court system. So under the Trump administration, the Attorney General has a huge amount of power, has basically eliminated administrative closure and the ability to terminate cases when for very good reasons. Another branch of government, let's say, needs more time to process a visa. Now they're not going to get that time, and the courts are going to be forced to deport the person. It does not allow judges to have really docket management tools, right? It doesn't allow the judges to prioritize the most severe and serious cases. The Attorney General has also been more active, and I'm referring to Sessions, but Barr has also been fairly active. But Sessions has definitely been more active than any previous Attorney General in stepping in and reversing decisions of the Board of Immigration Appeals. That's how the first step in eliminating gender as a form of protection. And then that's been reinforced in a proposed regulation, which is still being discussed. There was also a case completion quota set for judges to complete 700 cases a year. The concern here, of course, is that rushes judges through the process where they're not really taking the due process time that they need to thoroughly evaluate the case. Now, I will say, as a practitioner in a detention center court, the judges in detention center courts have not been concerned about this because they are typically deporting way more people than 700. They have a lot of people who will just come through, ask for deportation, or otherwise are not eligible for any form of relief. And so it's very easy for them to get to that number. But for non-detained cases, it's much more challenging. And then there's been a lot of changes with regards to the hiring and the review process for judges who, remember, are employees of basically the Attorney General. So to my knowledge, Biden hasn't said anything about the independence of the court system. He has said that he will privatize it, as David mentioned, detention centers, which hopefully will take out the profit motive and the cost cutting measures that sometimes mean, the quality of food and medication are not really in line with human rights standards. And that's, in our review very positive, because having private actors is not just, that's not really a Trump thing. That's a problem that's been historically an issue within the immigration detention system. So we're happy to see that's being addressed. This is something that's not, shouldn't really even be controversial. The Bureau of Prisons has said that they're phasing out private ownership of the prison system for a ton of reasons, and you can read their report. And so those certainly it makes sense for that to apply in the immigration system as well. And the last point I would just mention, I think a lot of people have probably forgotten about this. I know I had, but the Central American Minors Program was ended by the Trump administration. Biden saying he'll reinitiate that program. And that's where individuals are legally in the US but have children living abroad. And so it allows them to bring their children sort of through a more sometimes expedited process in theory, or in cases where they wouldn't otherwise be eligible to bring their children. So if I recall correctly, I think if someone has temporary protective status, they're allowed to apply and bring their children, whereas usually you have to be a permanent resident or a citizen. And so that program was just kicking off in the Obama years. A few, I think I may have been several hundred minors were able to come, but it wasn't very many before it was ended. And so that might be back on the table under a Biden administration. We have a few more things to go through with regards to kind of visa processing and DACA. But I think, David, why don't we I'm just looking at the time. If you have any other comments on what I just said or something you feel like is really important to let people know about, perhaps you can share that. And then I want to make sure we can turn it over to the professor to share his comments about what's going on in the immigration community.
I think we should do that so we can then get some questions afterwards.
I'll just mention two things very briefly. One thing is, I think it's important to realize that the Biden campaign and Joe Biden is not an immigration radical by any stretch of the imagination. The most likely thing that we will see is sort of a return to the status quo ante in the Obama years, right? To my knowledge, he's not an open border kind of a person. He's not wanting to get rid of ICE, et cetera. But one thing that I think that is an important difference that I don't recall the Obama administration engaging in is that Joe Biden has proposed taking a regional approach to addressing the factors that are driving immigration from the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. In other words, talking about increasing aid, talking about bettering relations with the administrations of those countries to have it less necessary or have it not be necessary for so many people to feel that their only option is to flee those places, right? This reminds me a bit of David Bacon's, a well-known journalist that covers a lot of migration issues and also is a very famous photographer, who's the author of a book called Illegal People, and says, well, yes, those of us that are interested in human rights might want to talk about freedom of movement. We also need to talk about freedom of not having to move. And I think that this is something that the Biden campaign's position paper, at least, suggests that would be a rather marked change from the Trump administration's position regarding the underlying causes of migration, attempting to deal with those, which are going to be including increasingly matters of climate change, because there's already a lot of evidence that people are fleeing Guatemala and Mexico and Honduras and other places precisely because of drought, because of the inability for them to engage in small-scale cash farming, et cetera. This is something I've seen with my own eyes in Mexico, where aquifers that formerly were being used to water lettuce fields have run out. And so this is something I think that would be a difference, but again, requires budgeting from Congress and things like that. So I think that, but I think that would be my sort of summary of the Biden campaign's positions on migration.
Okay, well, thank you, David, for your valuable insight, both your historical perspective as well as some of this big picture, the context. So we will have in the closed captions an English translation of the Spanish. If you're not seeing the captioning coming up yet, there's a button that says CC at the bottom of the screen. You should be able to click there and change your settings so that you can see the translation. My first question to the professor is, can you tell us a little bit about what is happening in the immigrant community here in San Antonio? Entonces, mi primera pregunta es que usted nos puede decir un poco de lo que está pasando en la comunidad inmigrante en San Antonio.
Sí, bueno, la comunidad inmigrante pues está un poco desinformada. Medios de comunicación, redes sociales no dan una información exacta y también pues falta de interés del inmigrante en algunos casos para poder informarse. Han pasado muchas cosas estos últimos 3 años con la comunidad inmigrante, ya que ha habido mucho temor de parte de nosotros, puesto que, pues, por todo lo que está pasando con la administración, ¿verdad? Entonces, se vive un incierto. Pocos inmigrantes buscamos un lado legal para informarnos y otros pues queremos, otros desean quedarse mejor como que no existe nada, solo ellos se levantan temprano, se van a trabajar, llegan a sus casas y ya no ven por un futuro mejor para ellos, por decirlo así, ¿verdad? Entonces, sí está siendo un poco afectada la comunidad inmigrante en este caso por todo lo que está pasando alrededor con la información, ¿verdad?, que se genera en el ambiente de inmigración.
¿Y qué sabe? Usted mencionó que los inmigrantes no son muy informados en general. ¿Qué saben ellos de las políticas de Trump y las políticas de Biden? ¿Saben mucho? ¿Saben poco? ¿Qué cosas, de qué cosas hablan?
La verdad, la política de Trump, del presidente actual, pues más que todo por noticia es por un rumor de lo que cuentan las personas que han ido a migración o las personas que no han ido a migración. Entonces, esa es la información que se corre, de que si vas a migración, vas a corte, si vas a una cita de migración, te van a agarrar, te van a deportar. Entonces, prefieren no ir, ¿verdad? Entonces, la política actual como que está atemorizando mucho el acceder mucho a sus citas con migración. Ahora, con el otro candidato a la presidencia, Biden, hay muy poca información. Lo que dicen comúnmente es que que pongan un presidente mejor que ayude al inmigrante, pero no hay una información clara o una propuesta clara. Bueno, tal vez sí la hay, pero no hay una información exacta o clara para los inmigrantes, para nosotros, la comunidad inmigrante.
¿Y qué piensa usted sería para nosotros importante saber de la situación de nuestra comunidad inmigrante, si sea aquí en San Antonio o tal vez en otras partes del país, ¿no? ¿Cuál es la cosa importante para nosotros? Y yo digo americanos que nacieron aquí, pero también los que han ganado la ciudadanía, si son de latinos o son de otra parte del mundo. ¿Qué debemos saber nosotros cuando vamos a votar o cuando vamos a hablar con nuestros representantes? ¿Cuál es la voz o la cosa que tiene la comunidad de inmigrantes aquí?
Eso sí es muy, muy interesante porque la voz de uno, pues son las personas, la voz del inmigrante o las personas que votan, su voz son las personas que van a ingresar al Congreso. Entonces, estaba intentando lo que estaban diciendo, descifrarlo, pero casi siempre nos enfocamos en el que va al presidente, pero se nos olvidan los que quedan en el Congreso, los que aprueban y quitan leyes y ponen leyes, los que dicen sí, los que dicen no. Entonces se nos olvidan esas personas que están ahí, porque tanto el presidente actual como el otro que quiera entrar lleva propuestas para el inmigrante, lleva propuestas para su país, pero se nos olvida, bueno, no sé, ¿verdad? Pero en mi punto de vista, se nos olvida que la mayor parte de decisiones están entre el Congreso. No sé si me estoy dando a entender correctamente. Entonces, si hay una persona que está en el Congreso, es mi voz, es mi voto, es el voto de la persona que se quiere hacer pronunciar. Entonces, lo que deben de saber de nosotros es que somos una comunidad que queremos trabajar, que queremos tener una estabilidad de vida en este país. Yo sé que no es nuestro país y por eso tenemos que respetar más al doble, pero queremos una estabilidad de vida en el cual pues podamos ser tomados en cuenta.
Y hablando un poco de eso, nosotros escuchamos mucho del presidente y el profesor David tal vez puede hacer comentarios de eso también, pero no, nosotros escuchamos mucho del presidente que los inmigrantes son criminales, son hombres malos, que están aquí para aprovechar el sistema pidiendo asilo. Entonces, del punto de vista de usted, yo sé que usted no conoce todo el mundo que viene aquí para emigrar, ¿cierto? Pero con los que usted conoce, ¿quiénes son? ¿Por qué están aquí? Si hay algo que usted piensa que son importantes saber de ellos, ¿cuál es la realidad, digamos?
Bueno, sí, es muy interesante. Para mí hay tres puntos que quiero remarcar y casi lo vamos a ver y bueno, los abogados que trabajan mucho en inmigración se van a dar cuenta en esto. Todo aquel inmigrante que ingresa a este país y busca un proceso legal viene de su país porque tuvo algún problema, algún riesgo con pandillas o alguna amenaza política por perder hacia su persona y hacia su familia. Entonces, cuando se ingresa a este país con el temor de que mi vida corre riesgo, entonces yo no estoy viniendo a este país queriendo aprovecharme del sistema, sino que vengo a cuidar mi vida, a pedir una protección para mi vida y la vida de mi familia. Pero si soy un inmigrante que no busca lo correcto de la ley de este país, que no busca, no sé cómo decir la palabra exacta, pero que no busca cumplir las leyes de este país, por temor a que me busquen en mi récord, tengo algún mal récord criminal y pueda ser deportado, porque puede tener una orden de captura en nuestro país y si aparece puede ser deportado y encarcelado. Entonces, en esa forma podríamos clasificar nuestra comunidad de inmigrantes. Lastimosamente, por esos malos hechos que aparecen, que mucho inmigrante ingresa a tener una vida de desorden, somos nosotros los que sí queremos tener una vida normal, también somos tachados o como criminales. Lastimosamente lo que hace uno, pues lo pagamos todos, ya aunque no debería de ser así, pero en este caso, pues así nos toca.
Um, David, I'm going to throw you on the spot and ask you if you had anything you wanted to ask of the professor or anything that you wanted to add to what he said. Voy a pedir al profesor David si tiene alguna pregunta por usted o si quiere añadir algo sobre ese tema.
Pues algo, profesor, del que se ha hablado mucho es el miedo que sienten las familias migrantes aquí en este país, bajo la amenaza de deportación, las redadas, etc. Tengo la impresión que en cierto sentido la ciudad de San Antonio es más tranquila con respecto a la presencia de la migra, pero sé que uno viviendo constantemente bajo la amenaza de la deportación, que eso provoca mucha angustia. Y le pregunta a usted cómo se siente estando aquí o cómo la gente se siente estando aquí en esta ciudad sin la protección de la ley, o sea, sin tener documentos, con esta constante amenaza de ser detenido y de ser deportado a su país.
Sí, es bastante interesante la pregunta. Es muy duro levantarse todas las mañanas y si uno tiene familia, eh, despedirse de su familia porque sabe cuando en el momento que uno sale, pero no sabe si va a regresar, si va a pasar algo en el transcurso del día y luego va uno con la mentalidad, bueno, puede separar mi familia, no sé si voy a regresar. Entonces, el salir de la casa de uno, despedirse de su familia, pidiéndole a Dios regresar y volver a encontrar su familia, pues ya es un día de victoria para uno. ¿Ya? Entonces, ese es vivimos como cada día ese riesgo, vivimos nuestra vida en ese límite que en un segundo nos puede volver a cambiar nuestra vida por completo. Ese es nuestro pesar de cada día.
Pues en conclusión, profesor, ¿tiene algo más que le gustaría comentar? Después vamos a pasar al tiempo de las preguntas, pero le doy la oportunidad por alguna conclusión o otro comentario si a usted le gusta.
Sí, en conclusión, pues nosotros somos seres humanos como cualquiera de los que estamos aquí, ¿verdad? Con ilusiones, con metas, con sueños, con familia, con deseo de superarnos. Tuvimos un cambio de vida al estar en nuestro país y al estar acá. Y ese cambio de vida que nos generó, pues tenemos toda la ilusión de aprovecharlo. Entonces, en conclusión es que venimos y queremos superarnos, queremos dar lo mejor para nuestros hijos, nuestra familia, que es el sueño de todo padre, ver a sus hijos en un país próspero y que ellos tengan un buen futuro.
Pues muchísimas gracias por compartir con nosotros la perspectiva de usted y la comunidad aquí. Entonces, creo que ahora vamos a tomar algunas preguntas. Entonces, si las personas quieren poner las preguntas por el chat, Jim nos va a hacer las preguntas. So,
Yeah, I've picked up 3 questions so far. One of them being, what's the average cost per bed in the detention centers billed to the United States? I don't know if you happen to know that, but if there's 35,000 beds that are billed, how much money are we talking about?
the overall immigration budget is in the billions. It's higher than, I believe, even the Department of Defense budget. But it depends on the facility. So a standard adult detention facility will be possibly around $90 a day. Family detention per person is over 300. I think it's about 325 a day. And for unaccompanied minors, in some cases, it goes up to over 700 a day. So typically what happens is the first number of beds are at a higher rate, and then the last number of beds are at a lower rate. And there are statistics on this. I think the data that I have is probably about a year, maybe 2 years old. But if folks want to email me, I do have a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that lists the detention center costs for at least the adult facilities.
Okay. The second question was from the representative of the Montgomery County, Maryland Immigration Rights Group and the question is about removing the possibilities of removing the immigration judges from the supervision of the Attorney General's office and linking them to the federal judiciary. Is that anywhere in the policy pipeline on the part of anybody?
I don't think that the Biden campaign has proposed anything like that. Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I do think it's reasonable to ask that question, right? Because one has to remember that the Department of Homeland Security was just created in 2003. Prior to that, and one of the reasons it was created was to unify some border functions under the same executive branch agency. So it used to be that the Immigration and Naturalization Service was under the Department of Justice. Mm-hmm. The immigration courts remain under the Department of Justice. And the Bureau of Customs Enforcement, I forget what exactly the name of it was back then. I think it was Bureau of Customs Enforcement, was under I believe the U.S. Department of the Treasury, right? And so this kind of reorganization has occurred within, relatively recent history. So it seems like it might be an impossible or an impossibly radical thing to do, but it's certainly, things like this do get done and have been done relatively recently. And Sarah, I don't know if you'd have anything else to add about that.
So I haven't heard as either political party has talked about making the courts independent. I will say that this is one of the main topics that the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, has been advocating around with members of Congress. Because it is Congress that's going to need to go in and make these courts independent. And so the Executive Office of Immigration Review includes the immigration judges and the Board of Immigration Appeals. And that is within the Department of Justice. And the reason why AILA has made this a big campaign issue in Congress, one, because of the due process issues with conflating the sort of enforcement executive branch with the judicial, which, even in the best cases where it might not have the appearance of impartiality, even where the judges, really are trying to be impartial, simply because of that fact. And so one of the reasons why I believe that, I shouldn't speak for them, but I believe that Ayla has been making this a big issue is because it really is not a political issue. It's really just about constitutional separation of powers. And Republicans, are support, to some degree, certainly. I mean, put aside the politics, right? Are interested and sort of supportive of this idea as well. One of the other issues, just as a brief side note, that Ayla has been advocating for is good governance with USCIS visa processing. Visa processing wait times have increased. I think it's 46 or 47%. Under the Trump administration. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but it's not because applications have gone up. Part of it, and I don't work there, so I can't give you the complete picture on this, but part of it is because there's been more fraud investigations and sort of more interviews being given where that wasn't done previously. And so if folks want, on our website under our in the news section, we have an op-ed on it, the courts being independent. It's actually several years old, but this has been an ongoing issue. And then I believe it was our February newsletter where we talked about the independence of the court system and kind of provide an update on some of the things that have been going on. But it is something that is a big concern, I think, for all attorneys and really doing any kind of immigration work. And
Can you put the Migrant Center website in the chat so that when people save the chat,
yes,
at the end they'll have. The third question that came through is, ideally, what would a regional American plan look like to resolve migration to the U.S. and stabilize home countries of origin?
That's a big question. It's an important question. And I think that something that I have talked about in the past in my writing and in public speaking I've done on these issues has been that, there is not something that we can talk about as being a separate Mexican economy from the US economy, or a separate Central American economy from the US economy. We live in a regional and globalized economy that includes specific trade arrangements that are negotiated among countries, right? And unfortunately, these trade agreements have not typically included questions of migration and development of differing regions within the trade areas, right? So the United States has a trade agreement with the Central American countries, has a trade agreement with Mexico. The United States has generally refused to connect these agreements to matters of labor rights, migrant rights, et cetera, and really has not been interested in connecting these things to trying to bring about regional development that would really eliminate the need for migration. And I think one of the things that's important for us to realize is that although legally speaking, there's an important distinction that is made between migrants, between refugees, asylees, and economic migrants, in practical terms, all of these people are effectively displaced people, right? And they're people that are displaced by policies that emanate from the capitals of not just the countries where they're living, but also foreign capitals, and whose lives and livelihoods are influenced by the actions taken by transnational forces. And so I think that the sooner that we as a country and the sooner that we as a continent, meaning the Americas, can come to grips with that and begin to try to make investments in parts of our region that are in need, just as the European Union did 30 years ago, trying to bring, say, Spain and Portugal sort of up to similar levels of income and affluence as other parts of Europe. We could look to try to do something like that in the Americas. but it's been put off a long time because of the 9/11 attacks. It's been put off a long time because of nationalism. It's been put off a long time because of the insistence that each country has a responsibility only to take care of people who by accident of birth are its own citizens, and not looking at all the interconnections among us that need to be taken into account to address this problem.
Okay. I'm going to need to bring this to a close. I had two things to say, two comments. One, Istra Furman, who is a sojourner at Quaker Meeting, was here earlier, and I'd hope to get her to say a couple of words about her project. She's working with the Friends Committee on National Legislation to lobby Texas legislators to support the extension of DACA, the bill that's passed the House. And she gave a quite wonderful presentation at the South Central Yearly Meeting last week. So if anyone wants to get in touch with her about that, just write me at clerk@saquakers.org. And I'll put that in the chat. If you want a copy of the chat, you just go over to the chat and there's three little dots to the right of file, and you click those and you can download a copy of the chat. But we will do that and make it available. And Sarah, how will we make the chat and recording available to people who want a copy?
So I will be the first one to admit that I am not a tech whiz and have not done a Zoom recording in the past. But as long as I get the Zoom recording in some video file format, I can upload it to the Migrant Center YouTube channel, and then I will be sending out an email through our listserv. So if you just want to get that recording and you don't want to be on our listserv, feel free to email me, but it is going to take potentially a couple days to get that put together. So, have a little patience with us. I just want to sort of conclude from our side, ways that folks can get involved. So I did mention there are at least 3 proposed regulations that are in the works that have public comment periods coming up in October. Obviously, we want everyone to get out and vote however you decide that you want to vote. And I'm going to put in the chat several resources from different organizations. The first is the American Bar Association that has information on polling places, deadlines, etc. around the country that you can share with folks. The next is a list of different organizations working on advocacy and due process rights and access to voting, and then a flyer that on who's eligible to vote. It includes age limits, etc. We are all, I think, very focused on the election, the presidential one more than anything, but as the professor had mentioned earlier, we need to remember that representatives in Congress often have a lot of power and say on this. And so we should be encouraging people to take a stand and put forward positions that then we can hold them to after the election. But we're also going to need to continue to do advocacy, regardless of who's elected, with everyone in public office. You certainly can advocate by writing op-eds in your local paper. I would encourage everyone to make it a point to talk to one family member or one friend after today's conversation and just share one thing that you learned or one thing that you thought was important, so that we can continue to engage as a community in these discussions. And then we encourage you all to stay informed by signing up for our newsletter. The email address where you can do that, that will go to me directly, is in the chat. And then there's a list of immigration issues that Ayla put together. I'll put the link here in the chat that has more information also on some of the different topics that we talked about. So I hope this has been informative for everyone. And with that, I'll conclude my part of the presentation.
Okay. Thank you all very much. And for the members of meeting here, I ask you to hold